first.
All right. Well, good evening. It is evening. Good evening, Mayor and Council members. Happy to be here. We've been working on this code for quite a while now. And Ian's, can you see the screen?
Yep.
Okay. We're going to talk about the zoning code update and give you a bit of an overview. There's a lot of stuff, and I'm sure you've read every page. So it's a lot of material. So what we wanted out of this meeting is to give you kind of a first overview of the big stuff and what to really look for. Also to take any questions that you have, any early comments that you have. And of course, by the end, we'll be talking about next steps, but I'll tell you in advance that we will need to update the draft because we were rushing basically the past month to get the draft out. But there's still a little bit more vetting that needs to happen. And there was actually two little sections, a couple pages each, that we realized weren't in here. So we need to work on those. One of them, I think, is the non-conforming uses, and another one was the unit lot subdivisions. But there's some other, like, you'll probably come across, there's a couple like cross references that we didn't cross the T on. So we'll need to do some of that. And so here and there, we've got our own master version that we've got a bunch of comments and things highlighted that we need to work on. In fact, we're just talking with Lisa and to try to extend the date a little bit to allow us the time to get that done right. And also Ian's going to be in Europe for 2 weeks in between to allow us some flexibility to get that done right, so we get you a good, solid final draft and help you head into the public hearing and the adoption process. So.
Time out. Wait a minute, Bob. I have a question. What isn't this Ian's second trip to Europe while we've been doing this zoning code update?
Ian, you got the floor.
No, I went to Paraguay back in October.
So that was it. Okay, well, wrong continent.
Europe, technically, but.
Okay, just checking.
Good point. Yeah, good point, Lisa.
Let's just say that his Christmas card's going to have some fun, diverse pictures on it this year.
I guess
that's all I say.
All right. Sorry. Okay. I just had to ask the question.
Yeah. So I'll go over the introduction here, but we're going to kind of go through again the key parts of the code. Keep going, Ian. Next slide. So the background is, as many of you were probably there, or all of you, in adopting the comprehensive plan. And so we're here to implement that with the zoning code. There have been no major code updates since the 1990s. And that means like 30 years ago. So it's time to make an update. Even if the code was awesome and perfect, 30 years warrants an update anyway. So major consolidation of the code chapters, which I'll get into in a minute. And we also want to align with some newer standards and documents like the Complete Streets Plan. So the objective here to implement the comp plan, also make this easy to use and for both staff, you, applicants, community members, easy to understand, and also to comply with state requirements. And just on top of that, we code work and design regulations are pretty much like what I've been doing for 25 years. And, it's fun to work on these projects, like all the problem solving, but each project you learn new things. So we're sort of integrating our best practices with that, but also working with Lisa, knowing the community is trying to fit the regulations that fit Aberdeen. And that's what's been helpful is with the 4 or so committee meetings, including some of you, working out some of the early concepts to make sure that it fits the comp plan that you did and the community and the context. So next slide. The time frame, this just kind of shows what we've been through, starting last summer, beginning of the fall, with a kickoff meeting with the Planning Commission, doing some staff interviews late fall, and then between the winter and now holding, like I said, I think 4 committee meetings to go over some of the concepts, and then we expect, another couple council meetings after this with the adoption process. Next slide. So included in the scope, some new zones, which Ian's going to talk about, the code reorganization, which I'll talk about very shortly here, some strategic design standards for commercial and multifamily, the procedures, adding some new and clarifying procedures for permits and adding a new subdivision ordinance, updating landscaping parking codes, and Ian will talk about streets and development frontage improvements. And also we pretty much a new sign code too. What we aren't include are engineering standards, which you already have that as a separate parallel thing, but we've been trying to coordinate what you have and with Public Works with the street standards that we're proposing here. And we're not really addressing changing any of the existing historic preservation provisions. In fact, those historic preservation provisions are in your zoning code now, but we're, I believe, proposing to move those into another title. I think fitting in with some of the environmental provisions where we think will fit. Next slide. And before I get into this, the reorg, I also want to say that feel free to ask and raise your hand or interrupt Ian and I to ask any questions you might have. What we'll try to do is we'll get through each division and stop for questions and any comments. But if you have the urge to ask questions and stop us, please do. We got a lot of slides here and there's a lot of material to cover. So we'll do the best we can to get through this. So let's talk about the goals, I believe, with this. And so the reorganization, again, we're trying to make it easier to navigate. Right now you have 27 chapters, but it's pretty typical of most codes. I mean, one of them we had like 58 chapters. And so what we're trying to do is narrow this down to maybe 6 to 8 overarching, we're calling them divisions. And so to just make it easier to navigate for all the users, and also adaptable to your changes that happen down the road. So you're not, the way your code's set up now is, let's add another chapter. Let's add another chapter. We're trying to make this more adaptable to how things happen in the future. Next slide. So these are the overarching divisions. And this is a pretty typical thing that we've tried to do. Just general provisions, division 1, procedures is the second one, permits, which includes like conditional use permits, subdivision permits. Division 3, zoning and land use is, I think, one of the biggest ones. And again, you'll talk about that, as well as community design is kind of the streets, subdivision design, the bigger stuff. And then project design are the actual standards that you use to address individual site development permits. So that includes the design standards, parking, landscaping, signage, and even like fences. Next
and this
slide.
is also how we've organized the presentation. So we're going to work our way through these divisions.
And so the hierarchy of this is you've got title 17, and then comes the division, and we got 6 of them. And then after that, you've got chapters under each division. And then of course you've got the sections. And then the next slide explains On the left, which you can't read, but there's the 27 or 28 current chapters, and just what we've done in the Word document, you'll see on the right is the location in the new code, and the color, the shading there matches up with the different divisions there. Next slide. So Division 1 is the general provisions, and there's just 2 chapters there. And general provisions, mostly the stuff that's in your current chapter 1704. We've reorganized it a little bit. There's a few new sections as noted there. And then it's definitions, and there's a lot of updates there. You know, we've taken out stuff that you don't have, we don't use anymore. And there's quite a few updates in that. And generally, the other thing I forgot to mention is at the beginning of the document, we try to explain what's new versus, you know, what's a change to existing. So you'll see like the chapter or the section there, but then after you might see new. And if that's the case, all the text under that's just new. And in some cases, you'll see track changes, and that means these are changes that we're proposing from like a current code section that occurs in parentheses after the chapter or section title. So we're just trying to be transparent about what the proposal is and what's changed. Next slide. Division 2 is procedures, and really trying to clear things up here and consolidate, because right now your procedure stuff is all over the place. And this allows us to be a little bit more consistent across the board. There's just two chapters, one on the procedures and one dealing with revisions and expirations. And the next slide gets into the chart. And this is a pretty typical, most cities have review process types like this, 1 through 4, or some have 5. The first 2 are both the administrative type decisions. The third is a hearing examiner. 4th is planning commission. Third is planning commission. Oh wait, I'm sorry. There's 3 HE, 3 PC, and those means the HE obviously is a hearing examiner decision, and the 3 PC is planning commission, and 4 is council. And then you can see what types of permits are below that. And then the next slide explains some of the details then regarding, you know, is a pre-app conference required? Do you need a neighborhood meeting? Notice of application. So you see there the difference between type 1 and type 2. Type 2, you need a notice of application. Type 1 is the really small ones. You don't need that. And then you see, you know, comment periods. Is there a recommendation? And you can see the rest, but it just tries to be very clear, and you can see the differences across the board, and is what we've worked on with a number of different cities and with council members and with the attorneys on this. And so anyways, it's what we're proposing here. Next slide.
I have a question, Bob, before we move on. Well, no, it's fine. So the changes, when I have suggested changes, having them in the tracking mode is fine, correct? When I send those to you?
Sure.
Okay. All right.
When you send me, like, you'll in the updated document, and we'll be able to see the tracking. If you just do it in Word and you propose a change, then we'll be able to see those changes.
Okay.
When in doubt, just highlight or add a comment.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure, so if there's changes that come in, you'd rather get them in the track changes mode so that it's easier to implement or not versus another way. Okay. And definitely. I'm almost done. I'm just gonna, I probably should send them to you in sections versus all at once, but you're gonna probably get them all at once.
It's probably easier that way.
Whatever works.
Yep.
Okay.
So here you can see an example of This is just a screenshot. I'm trying to remove something from my screen so I can see the top. There we go. Application notice, just some of the details. I'm not going to go through these, but we try to dot the I's here and just lay it out very clearly for everybody. Next slide. Division 3 gets into permits, and so you can see here there's 5 chapters. Administrative site plan review is just your basic fallback of building permits, site plan development. And then you see the land division, which is a whole new subdivision ordinance. We've got a separate chapter for boundary line adjustments. And then, of course, conditional uses. And then you can see to the right there, whether it's new or an update of the some of those current chapters, like conditional uses and variances. Next slide. So you can see here the tracking of administrative site plan review, and it's new, but there's some materials that we are based on some existing sections overall. And a big part of these is really making clear what the review criteria is. And in most cases, we're referring to other chapters here. Next slide. So land divisions, as I mentioned, you don't have really, you don't have much of a subdivision ordinance right now. And, and as we know, most of the city's already platted. You're not going to get that many big subdivisions, but you do want to have some clear rules, even for small subdivisions, or I guess in the future, if there is some annexation. Another thing is we had already talked about creating a unit lot subdivision. That I realized actually today that we didn't have it in there. So it's something that we need to add, and we've been working with Commerce on middle housing provisions and trying to make recommendations for cities across the state on unit lot subdivisions. And there's a lot of cities that have those ordinances, and we've done a number of them. So we'll add one to the subdivision chapter.
And that's a really valuable tool.
Ian, go ahead.
I was just going to say, but lot subdivision really is a really valuable tool to pair with middle housing when you're allowing you're going from single family to allowing, a duplex or a fourplex on a lot. And then allows that if they're all ground related units, if as long as it's not stacked, then you can do a lot subdivision and make those ownership units.
It's kind of like a condo where it's like you've got your regular subdivision lots, but this allows you to break up the lot for the purpose of ownership. For, like, let's say you put a duplex, and you could carve out different lots for each unit in that duplex. Unlike a condo is just recognizes the actual floor area in the unit. The unit lot can actually parcel out the land, but the unit lots can be smaller than the minimum lot size, because for the purposes of meeting setbacks and zonings, it's the parent lot that counts. The unit lot is just it's a form of subdivision that allows ownership. And as Ian mentioned, it's just a great opportunity to promote more ownership rather than just more rental options. So I think it's a great thing for cities and affordable housing, and for more first-time homebuyers.
Bob, I had a question about that. Could the zero lot line provision apply to a duplex where the duplex is right on the lot line and attached?
Yes, but it does.
Yeah.
We do that now. So we have duplexes being built on 25 footers that each one, the dividing lines down the center. So that, yes.
Okay. And then I've got a number of comments.
Ian, can you help me for a minute? I got to deal with my daughter here for a second.
Oh, okay.
Ian, I've got a number of comments and questions, and right now it's in a spreadsheet format that references the page. Would you prefer I transfer that into a track change Word doc?
I don't think that's necessary. I think a spreadsheet is especially if it's got page numbers, especially if it's got actually the headings.
Yeah,
Because the page numbers, can shift. That's actually super helpful. I think, yeah, I think track changes is fine. The way you've got it is fine. But the sooner the better. So, and we can get these integrated.
okay.
All right, next slide.
Okay.
Well, Ian, take it away.
Okay, great.
Good timing.
Yeah. Okay, great. So we get into Division 4 is really where we're talking zoning now. Get to the fun stuff. I think a lot of this will be pretty familiar from the previous meetings, and especially for those of you that were on the zoning committee. But a lot of this comes straight out of the comprehensive plan. So hopefully you don't see anything too shocking in here. And also there's a lot of stuff, as Bob mentioned, there's a layered and like a well thought out approach to how these are set up. So there's there are some things in here that are very relevant to zoning that we're not going to talk about in this division, like the design standards and parking and stuff like that comes in a later division. So here we're talking uses and dimensional standards is mostly what we're going to talk about in this Division 4. So we've got the zoning map. This is it's very similar to what was in the comprehensive plan, but with a few updates, and we'll talk about those. But first, we want to walk through the zones, which again have pretty much, I think, all the same names as the comprehensive plan designations. We're taking the material, the relevant material from your Title 17 zoning chapter and trying to consolidate it and make it so you don't have to go down to each individual zone to look up the standards, so that they are sort of in one centralized place for the use permissions, for the form and intensity standards. We have cross-references for each use that has use-specific standards or definitions, just so there's no ambiguity. And the permit reviewer and the applicant can both be talking about the same thing when we're applying for a specific use. And as we've been saying, yeah, reorganizing some of the existing chapters and sections. We've tried to track the changes from what's existing especially for these tables. It's a little tricky because some of these, you don't currently have well, I don't know. There's some zones that there's like a current analog, and some where it's a little bit, messier, iffier. So there's no current neighborhood center mixed use zone. So anyhow, it's not a change from an existing thing. It's just a new thing. So we're taking those use permissions, which currently are just lists in each zoning section, and trying to pull these into a table. And this is great because then they can be kind of more consistent all the way across. I was looking at all your use permissions as they currently are, and they're reasonably consistent. But then you realize, oh, it's like in this zone, it's defined. It's the wording is this way, and in this other zone, the wording is this other sort of similar but different way. Anyhow, so we can kind of all things, and compare them side by side and make sure that we don't have any weird outliers or things that we've forgotten about that really needs to be allowed in a certain zone. And then over in that far right column, there's the reference, which tells you which use, sort of special use section to look up to make sure you get the definition or if there's any special standards. So that's the sort of section that comes after these charts. Similarly, we've got the form and intensity standards all pulled together in a couple of tables, where again, currently the code has these listed out by zone in the chapter. So again, we can compare them side by side and make sure that we aren't leaving anything out, and that it's sort of the progression, the spectrum of zones makes sense and is getting to what we want. And so that's true for all of the zones that we're going to walk through. And just going to review where the zones have landed as the permissions are laid out in the draft document. And again, this is very similar from what's in the comprehensive plan and some of the drafts that we came to very early on in the project. But so we're looking, so we got the residential low zone. That's your the air of the single family residential zone. It covers a good chunk of the city there. You can see would allow up to 4 units on a lot. So detached houses, middle housing like a duplex, triplex, fourplex. Also ADUs, and would allow on corner lots up to 2,000 square feet of retail or cafe or small services or office.
Why only on corner lots? I mean, I see that a large lot in the middle of a low-rise residential might be big enough that it could accommodate a little coffee shop or something like that. Why limit that commercial to just the corners?
It's it's a big change from what the current rules are, and it's it is kind of can be like a different intensity. There are zones, but pretty much every other zone will allow that retail not on a corner lot. So if there is a location where it makes sense to have that wider range of uses, then we should change the zone. But it's useful to have I like to think of it as the zones as as the paints in our palette. And so we want to have a nice range of colors to be working with and a full palette.
I would say also corner lots are the most visible lots. They're at a street intersection. That means they're easier to get to, more readily visible to the community. And because you're fronting on 2 streets, it provided you have on-street parking available, that is a much bigger resource than is available. And you're able to more successfully integrate a use like that than you can on an interior lot that has more limited. An interior lot probably brings more, the impacts can be greater than they probably would be for a corner lot. So it's frequently, as Ian said, this is a pretty big change. So yeah, it's, not many cities go this route, but it's beginning to be discussed. And another thing is the legislation actually discussed potentially allowing for this on corner lots. I believe corner lots. Is that right, Ian? Mm-hmm. So it's not from out of nowhere, but we're trying to carve up our own limitations and rules that we think might work with it. So that's where it came from.
Can I add one thing too? And those are for new to the conversation. This came up when we were going through the comprehensive plan, and we had several neighborhoods that wanted to get back to the old neighborhood way of doing things, like where you had a neighborhood grocery store, or you had, a get-together area, dance studio, photography. And so we started talking about that when we were doing the comp plan, and it transferred into the zoning code because we'd like to see some of those gathering spots come back up. And we had a couple people that have approached us about opening, maybe having a small coffee shop or whatnot in some residential neighborhoods. So this was our toe back into those waters of yesteryear when we would have those neighborhood grocery, little markets.
And which would be, most often, almost invariably located on the corners, the crossroads. There's one of the changes one of the smaller changes here is just changing the front setback, reducing the front setback a little bit. We was hearing this is one of the most common variances that come across the counter, but we're maintaining the 20 feet for the garage setback. And that's primarily just to make sure there's room to park a car in the driveway that's not going to come out and block the sidewalk. But also it helps to highlight the front face of the house. You know, it's a little bit more pedestrian friendly. The porch can extend in the front setback. And there is also, there's a mechanism, because sometimes you have some pretty wide rights of way in a lot of places in Aberdeen where the streets isn't actually using even like necessarily half of the right of way. So we built in a mechanism so you can even reduce that front setback further when there's a lot of undeveloped space in between the edge of the right of way and the sidewalk. The middle housing, so we said up to 4 units on a lot, and it is depending on the size of the lot. With smaller lots, because you do have a lot of small lots that are non-conforming in Aberdeen, would still be allowed 1 or 2 or 3 lots depending on the size. It's like 1,250 square feet, you know, per unit. So you know your 3,000 square foot lot, you can get 2 units. Anyhow, scales up. These in different configurations. They could be detached. Could be like all in one building, or could be preserve one house in the front and you build kind of a new duplex in the back. Just some different options. There are design standards that actually are in this title or this division rather that apply to middle housing. They're pretty lightweight and should be easy to administer, but it's just like there needs to have pedestrian access to the street. You need to have covered entries of 3 feet where folks are coming into their homes. If you do have an alley and it's improved and passable and accessible, the parking needs to come off of the alley. There are some limitations on garage doors, and also which are related to limitations on driveways, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. Oh, yes. Yeah, we'll get into more with the driveways, and then a rule requiring some facade articulation, some kind of differentiation when you have a bunch of ground-related units that are side by side, just so it's a little more clear that these are separate units and it's not just kind of a wall of building. Yes?
Ian, for the cottage housing, you've got in the write-up that the entries have to be towards the common space, but for cottages that have street frontage, it seems to me that it would be more desirable to encourage street at the frontage on the street side so that you've got eyes on the street. Maybe there's a sliding door or a back door that goes to the common area, but if there's one main entrance, I would prefer that it would be off of the street.
Sounds like a good point.
Or maybe on the side, but in part for privacy and in part to just have that relationship with sidewalk and street.
But you might not be able, if you did a cottage style, you may not be able to have facing the street.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
Where it's possible.
Well, cottage.
Versus like something in that bottom picture versus that.
Well, there was one diagram in the draft that showed cottage housing off of the street, and it just seemed a little wonky to have an access sidewalk that would go off of the street and essentially around the building to get to a entryway that faces a open common space.
Yeah, usually with cottages, you know, usually they're clusters, and I think Ian talked about this, but the ones that where you have cottages on a street, usually we've got standards that still have a covered entry, at least visible as the street. So, you know, usually what you do in those instances is have the porch or covered entry on the side, and you've got the walkway coming in. So you don't have a blank wall. You're not looking at the back of a cottage from the street. You still have a friendly, you still want to respect the street, but you also want to try to create the big point of a lot of the cottage clusters is to create a cluster around an internal courtyard. But
yeah, right.
And
Yeah.
that's what I would prefer that versus the street, but it's just me personally.
But maybe I'm gonna park on the street to get to my house
Then you're walking.
and.
Yeah, so that's when you've got, in that case, you've got the common area is in the middle and the cottages around the side. And so you
could have a back door or something.
Yeah, we've got standards that cover that. We've got standards that make the street front still have direct access and entries. So I think you'll, when you read the standards, I think you'll be okay with them based on your comments.
I recall those standards, and another concern I had was where there's street access, then the access for parking needs to be off of the street as compared with off of an alley. And in my mind, wherever there's an alley, I'd much rather see the parking on that alley side.
Absolutely.
Rather than the street.
It is required. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Where there's an improved alley,
Yeah.
it's required.
Yes.
We shift. Well, where you actually have access. When you just have grass that people, there's no access to it, that we don't even consider that improved.
Mm-hmm.
But we did make that a requirement when we went through that housing section, that we would require parking to come off the alley if it were possible.
On Capitol Hill, Bo had parking in the back under their townhome, but they also had a parking permit for an extra car.
Yeah.
So they could park on the side street.
Mm-hmm.
But there was you had to have the permit. Like he said, Mom, when you get here, you need to come and get the permit to put in your car so that I wouldn't get towed.
Mm.
So I don't know if we can do that.
We did not dive into permitting for parking at all, did we? Because we kept the spaces at 2 per unit and being allowed to use the driveway. I suppose maybe we could talk about that. I don't want to, never mind, scratch that. We will do that internally. So never mind. Let's just go forward. I think that's a really
valuable
suggestion.
effort that we probably don't want to.
No, because this has come up in another, when we've been talking about parking permits and a whole nother subject, it came up. So let us do internal research ourselves, and I don't want to bog this down, but that's not a bad suggestion.
And just again, there's a lot of different ways that this can work out and combine with ADUs, and we want to be thoughtful about how the ADUs are fitting in there. Fortunately, you all have a bit more flexibility than cities that are in the GMA counties, because the state laws are a little complicated in the way those ADUs and middle housing fit together. And just a reminder that Aberdeen is mostly built, mostly been built there, so you are likely to see some change in the neighborhoods, as a result of the zoning change, but you're unlikely to see a whole block turnover or a huge change happening in a short span of years. We're sort of building in the sort of flexibility for gradual change over time, is the idea here. As I mentioned, ADUs are part of the mix. The Aberdeen has ADU code, and we didn't actually make as many modifications here as we did to a lot of other things. So you've still got the 800 square feet limit. There is, and then these are treated that as a density for that, or as a unit for that density measurement. When I said like smaller lots, more units, bigger, or smaller lots, fewer units, bigger lots, more units, ADUs count towards that. They also have the one parking space required for ADUs. That's in the current code. But the new code would remove the owner occupancy requirement for ADUs, which makes sense if you're allowing duplexes and everything. So that's the residential low zone. Residential high is pretty much just maps right onto your existing multifamily zones. This would allow townhouses, middle housing, and also apartments and condos. It also has that corner lot provision with allowing 4,000 square feet of retail. In those cases, allows up to 4 stories, 45 feet. And then the design standards for this, Bob will talk about a little bit later on in the project design chapter. And also there's some tweaks to the parking requirements, and we'll talk about those later as well. The waterfront residential zone is similar to the residential low. You've got your 1 to 4 units, but there are some mandatory flood hazard protection measures that are already in code that but anyhow, we just want to link this zone to that to make sure that if you're building anything new in these zones, it's going to be floodable, basically. The flex residential zone is also kind of similar to residential low, but has a lot more business use allowed, including even some light industrial uses with adequate screening. And this is applied in the sort of the south of 101, there on the west side of town, and then also in the area around the old, I think it's the old Weyerhaeuser Mill, south of the Chehalis River. Talk about the mixed use and commercial zones and also the other, let's see, and the industrial zone. First off is your downtown mixed use. Same boundaries, I think, as your current downtown zone. Very flexible zone, not too many changes here, but there are some changes some changes that come with the design standards that Bob will talk about, and block frontage standards. And this is moving towards a little bit more of a form-based approach. You may have heard of form-based codes. Makers doesn't go all in for form-based codes, but we do a kind of a hybrid approach. And where it makes sense, we don't really care what's happening inside of the building, but we do care about what's happening on the front of the building, on the outside of the building. And that's where the block frontage standards come into play. So again, it's a very flexible zone, but there are more stringent requirements for the design of the building and prohibitions on ground floor residential on the storefront streets, which we'll show you a map of in a little bit. We've got the neighborhood mixed use, which is kind of the younger little brother of the downtown mixed use zone, and this is new. Right. This is looking at a lot of different parts of the city, some of which have commercial zoning, some of which have multifamily zoning, and kind of getting places from all over the city. And that goes back to what Lisa mentioned, that sort of historic urban form where you have little neighborhood centers, little coming together places. And so it's a flexible zone, allows residential and commercial uses, nothing that's kind of cause a lot of nuisances. But your retail, your small offices, your eating and drinking and things like that, medical uses within a certain size limitations on certain uses under 10 or 20 or 30,000 square feet, depending on the use. And you can see those again in that use permissions table. Allows 4 stories in most cases, but you can go up to 7 stories or 6 stories on the very large sites. And that's it. The commercial zone is a little bit less of a change. It's mostly applied in the similar areas to what you've got now. They're mostly along 101 and also on, I think, 105. Just your basic kind of commercial zone, pretty flexible, allows residential in some cases, but it's not really for residential. It's just allowing some flexibility there. A waterfront zone is pretty flexible. It's kind of like the commercial zone, but it's a little bit more residential oriented, and it allows more kind of your marine oriented commercial and industrial uses. And that's, applied in a pretty small area there near the Wishkah, the mouth of the Wishkah River. And then you've got your flex industrial zone, which is whoops, I'm sorry. That's the words on the slide are wrong.
I know. I was going to tell you, Ian, that It's more of an industrial zone, as residential is not allowed except for caretaker. But you can cover the rest, Ian, if you've got it.
I mean, it's your industrial zone. Sorry, these are the wrong words. But allows some limited commercial uses. But you know, for the port and manufacturing, and whereas you would have a lot of screening requirements, and you know, more buffers and stuff in the other zones for these uses. Here you have less of that sort of a thing. I got excited about the photos, and then I didn't update the text. And then your civic zone, this is a zone just for basically your publicly owned properties for the most part, your medical and your educational uses primarily. We may have some City of Aberdeen facilities in there as well. I think it's mostly schools and medical, so it's pretty flexible zone to allow folks to do what they need to do. And there's also 3 open space zones, and these are little less typical, but and they're not that different from each other. But first off is the open space residential, and this is just sort of basically your reserve. You know, this is like undeveloped land that we don't want to encourage development, but it's okay if there's some development, some scattered development. So there's a density max of 2 units per acre. There'd be some option for like a cluster subdivision where if you had a large plot of land, say you had 5 acres, you're allowed 10 units, and you can sort of put those together in a little cluster subdivision, and you can reserve all the rest of the open space. That's something I would want to allow here. Other than that, just maybe a cabin or a house off in the woods, sort of a thing. The open space conservancy zone is not really intended for active use, but there are some public facilities in places with this zone. And then your open space park zone. There are some changes to the zoning map from the comprehensive plan, so I want to talk through those. Again, here's the map, current draft of it. The first off was around downtown and the Broadway Hill. The comprehensive plan expanded downtown sort of north up the hill and then had a big neighborhood center mixed use zone. Once we were looking at it and realizing that we have already the residential high zone has that flexible use where it allows those non-residential uses on corner lots up to 4,000 square feet. Sort of realized, then maybe that makes more sense for that area. That's more of what we were thinking about when we were working on the comprehensive plan. So that sort of northwesternmost bit of Broadway Hill kind of goes from neighborhood center down to residential high, and then part of that expanded downtown area goes down to neighborhood center. There also was a pretty expansive neighborhood center area mapped over in just east of the Wishkah River, and there's a spot where there's the auto dealership there. I can't remember which dealership it is, but it's that's not really doesn't match with the neighborhood center, which is supposed to be more of a walkable and pedestrian oriented kind of zone, at least compatible with that. And there's not really any way that would be. So the commercial zone seems like it makes, and also this is a very auto-oriented environment. It's got sort of it's like about the couplet there, so it's kind of an island surrounded by roadway anyhow. So that seemed like that made sense. There's an area, I think this is, I think we call this is like Finch Farms or something out here in South Aberdeen. There was it was an industrial zone under the current zoning on the books. And then in the comprehensive plan, we said flex residential makes sense, but looking further, it's like, oh, really, this makes most sense as just a residential low zone. And then finally, there's also there's a change here just west of downtown, where there's areas where the port, is constrained in land and is interested in the possibility of expanding. And so looking at it, there was some areas that are right next to the industrial zone currently that would be pulled into that flex industrial area. And just you can see there's sort of an existing mix of uses in this area. Some older houses, some newer houses, or some more or less well maintained, I should say, dwellings. These A and B photos kind of match these little yellow arrows, if you can see there. And that's the last of the mapping changes that we're going to cover.
And Ian, can I add to that too? The Flex
Please.
Industrial also came about by conversations with the Port of Grace Harbor and some of their internal wishes for room for expansion, as well as where we were heading with the planning commission. So we're kind of out of room, and we've got to figure out creative ways to fit what we want within what we have.
Hey, one question on that I was just thinking of, that I maybe just ask you is, since the Flex Industrial doesn't include any residential other than caretaker as a permitted use, one consideration, since you're going to make a lot of these homes non-conforming, is to basically say existing residential is a permitted use,
Yes.
is an option. Is that something we should add?
I have that change already in the code.
Okay.
I put in, so when I
Okay,
send that
okay.
to you, I have it in the chart with the asterisk by it, so. I
Okay,
did
just
that.
saying existing, so it's
Yeah.
not classified as a non-conforming use, but you can't build new. You can't
Well,
build
you
a new
could.
structure.
You could, right, if it were destroyed for natural causes, you have,
Yes.
currently we allow, you have a year within which to rebuild or to
But
start.
in
your
other
application.
circumstances, you could not.
Okay, perfect.
All right.
What if business, light industrial development doesn't happen at the pace at which we need housing? Or potentially we losing a whole bunch of housing?
No, because we're gonna try to encourage housing to develop more up on the hill than down below.
But a lot of that housing is like, I would think, more affordable, and we lose it. Housing up on the hills, and any new housing is going to be more expensive. The most
Potentially.
affordable housing will be the existing housing.
So the argument goes back to when you have places that want to build for jobs, where do you do that? Where's the room? Where's the room for expansion, especially around rail? And so I get what you're saying, but we also we're at that crux where we're out of property and jobs are important too. We have lots of room for housing available, but not a lot for growth in commercial or light manufacturing. So that was kind of the conversations we had when we went through the comp plan.
I remember.
You remember those conversations? But that was what we were looking at is, to be quite honest, let's just, and I'm sorry I'm derailing for a second, but one of the problems we're having, I'll take the South Shore Mall out of the equation, but if I had, say, Fred Meyer, Winco, or somebody that wanted to come in and build, where are we going to put them?
County.
But what if they don't want to be in the county, they want to be in the city? Where in the city do we have room for that growth?
I don't know that we do.
We don't. So that's the problem, though, is if we're the commercial hub for the county, those are the conversations internally that we need to have and decide, yes, we are, a lot of what we have is in the floodplain. When we're going to promote residential growth, the logical place is to get people up and out of that. It doesn't mean we can't have affordable property, but if our goal, is to eventually move people to safety, then we need to look at that flex residential and allow for that trickle to start coming in if it's warranted or needed. Doesn't mean the residential goes away, but we've got to look at ways that we can grow our city long after we're gone and provide that path and pathway and framework. And we talked about that because, to be quite honest, it'd be so nice to take the West End and be able to move everything uphill out of the inundation zone. That would be great. Is it possible in our lifetime? Probably not, but we can start leading that groundwork. And in some of what Ian had in that open space residential, the reason it was 2 units per acre is because there's a lot of peaks and valleys, undulations in our topography that make it really hard to go more than that. But there are certain areas where you could go outside of that and build housing. I think that the call isn't there yet, but leading that way and providing that framework, and that could be something as city council, that if you guys think that building infrastructure, getting infrastructure in place that makes that easily more accessible, that could be something that we work on internally too. So, I mean, it's just laying that groundwork. Sorry.
That's great. It's important stuff. Great. So we're about an hour in, and we're moving along well. But do we just want to do a time check? And we anticipate going on till hoping to have a time for questions at the end, but of a overall ending at around 8:30. Does that sound right?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Whatever we do.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Great.
We have till 9. I think we set it for a couple hours. So
right.
Yeah.
Right.
Just whatever time frame.
Perfect. Okay, well, great. So community. So we talked about the zones, dividing the city up and painting it different colors and allowing different uses in different places. The community design is sort of about what happens when you are going to develop and when you're going to do a bigger development. We talk about public street improvements, when those are required and what they are. Driveways and access, and especially shared driveways, get a little complicated, and we don't want that to be a big mess, or have a lot of impacts. And then also subdivision design and block structure. Now this division was not as polished in the version you all have as most of the others. In particular, I think the public street design section got kind of messy, and we are still communicating with Public Works about some of those standards, and need their feedback on some things. So that's a caveat. The public street design piece is one of the things I'll highlight in here. Was one of the top things, the number one policy recommendation in the comprehensive plan and the transportation element, is to have some standards on the books for what streets should be like in different places, have those differentiated, so you're not having a one-size-fits-all street design being applied, so that's one piece. We have got some partly built out anyhow here in Division 5, but the comprehensive plan again has sort of a classifications map of all the different roads. Again, try to get that differentiation, so you're not treating a neighborhood street the same way as you're treating a highway. It's also important to spell out when these things will apply, when these public street standards, and when the improvements must be installed or the road kind of brought up to the standard. That would be required with any new non-residential development, needs to bring the frontage up to the right-of-way standard. When you have new subdivisions or short subdivisions or binding site plans, and they do not have access from a public right-of-way, you need to be able to build streets to that standard. If there's a alteration of a commercial, industrial, or multifamily development that exceeds 50% of the property value, then that also triggers the frontage improvements requirement. And also anytime when you're creating a new access point that goes into a public street. We are working on having some basic standards in here. You can see there's quite a difference between an arterial and an alley design, but also this is something that's still in progress. welcome your comments all the same. On these, thinking about right of way width, the sidewalks, landscape area, pavement width, the number of lanes, if on-street parking is included, things like that, if bike lanes are included, things like that. Also in this division, more about driveways and access and some restrictions on both some minimums actually and maximums for driveways. But one of the minimums one of the maximums here is that you can only have one driveway per lot unless it's a lot that's more than 100 feet, or if there's multiple units that they serve. So you might see that with your middle housing development. These driveways on that single lot can't add up to more than 32 feet, and no individual driveway can be more than 20 feet together. And so we've got that diagram, but also we're trying to pull those standards together in some helpful charts in here in this section. And also you've got the 30-foot maximum width for commercial industrial driveways, and we still want to have mostly sidewalk when we're walking through the neighborhoods, not all curb cut. There's minimum widths as well, and then you get into the shared driveway standards. So you've got if you have up to 3 units, it can be 16 feet, but once you get up to 6 units, and you need to have an easement and pavement of 20 feet. And then once you get past 150 feet with up to 6 units, you need to have a turnaround there at the end of the driveway, so a fire truck can get out essentially. This is sort of what that can look like. Generally preferable from an urban form standpoint to have a grid of streets, but these can work well, and of course this is the only option in a lot of places when you're adding new housing. So we just want to be smart about the standards. That's a hammerhead style driveway here at the end, which takes up a little bit less space than like a full cul-de-sac roundabout kind of situation. You can just do, you can do a 3-point turn to get out. Great, and moving on to Division 6 project design, where we're looking more at the sort of graphs right onto the zoning code, and Bob is going to take us through it.
Thanks, Ian. Before I dig into those, any other comments, questions on Division 5, the community design stuff?
Well, that's a big change too.
I'll be sending mine in a spreadsheet.
Oh, okay.
Yes, yeah, we look forward to that.
All right, so we're down to our last division, but not least, project design definitely has more slides on it because it covers all of these components that you can see here. And in the next slide, really it's these 3 chapters comprise basically your design standards. And so these apply to commercial and multifamily and other non-residential development and zones, except for the flex industrial zone, which is exempt from these. The approach, though, the approach is, really we're zooming in on we try to just regulate the critical issues, the key issues that are important to you or just need regulating. Again, integrating some of the best practices based on our experience. Also making these clear, objective, and predictable, and that's actually a requirement now that the state legislature has passed, that you can't basically have design review that's uses lots of vague language like should or is encouraged, and have a design review board. So if it requires that standards be clear and predictable, and you shall, and what we try to do is have, a toolbox of options and do at least 2 or 3 of these to meet the standards. And so everybody knows what the minimum is. having lots of photos and illustrations, and even showing bad examples of what is not acceptable is a big part of the document that you'll see. But another thing to integrate some flexibility is to allow departures. And departures are different than variances because you can voluntarily depart from these provided specific ones. We there's probably about 30 or 40, maybe about 30 instances where we say there's a departure opportunity here. And sometimes we've got specific departure criteria, but most of the time it's like, as long as you meet the purpose, each standard or section has a purpose statement or intent statement at the beginning, and those are important. But the idea here is sometimes you want to allow a little bit of flexibility for some of these things. And so we've tried to integrate that strategically, and it'll be good for you to look at where we've proposed these. And sometimes we put parameters on how far you can go on them that are sort of guardrails. But it's an important thing to look at, and every city's different, and I remember working with Anacortes, they're like, well, we don't trust staff with allowing too much. So they wanted a lot of guardrails on their departures. So just letting you know, take a look at them. Block frontages. So this focuses on what you see from the street with where the building and parking lot location and the orientation. So the intent is to either to reinforce existing or desired patterns, like in downtown where you got your storefronts, or to emphasize the desired pattern of your built environment. And it also allows you to, provide flexibility where you want it and where you need it. Next slide. So storefronts, really we've identified these blocks here downtown where storefronts, if you've got a new building, build it right to the sidewalk edge and do a storefront, just like the picture or similar to, the existing storefronts downtown. So we strategically looked at those four streets, including Broadway. And Heron Street, for instance, we actually extended that further, but after our last committee meeting, we decided to cut it short of just one block east and west of Broadway to allow a little bit more flexibility there, particularly on that corner of what is that? H Street, South H Street. Yeah. Next slide. So, and then this is the details. I'm not going to go through these one by one, and you can't read them anyway, but they're in your document, and you can see that there's standards regarding the uses, floor to ceiling, minimum heights for those storefronts, retail space depth, about the building placement, about the entries. There's some transparency standards there, and you can see it in the image. So again, just try to be very clear what the standards are and where there's flexibility. You can see the little arrow symbol with a circle shows where you have a departure opportunity for those. Next slide. And then there's landscape frontages, which require a setback, modest setback, but still require like a covered entry facing the street, and also addresses in the detailed standards, have parking on to the side or the rear of development, and that automatically applies to any multifamily development, as well as any non-residential development in residential zones like those corner properties, and in the NCMU zone, except for where they choose to do a storefront. And then they could just build it right to the sidewalk. And then there's everything else, which is what we call basic. And these are the most flexible. So there's no, you could put your parking lot in front of the building. You could put it to the side. But there are some standards, so it just says, we encourage entrance to face the street, but at a minimum, have at least one building entry that's directly accessible from the street. And then there's some transparency standards, but they largely depend on the setback. The greater your setback, the reduced amount of facade transparency that you need. Next slide. And then I just want to say another thing about downtown. Again, you saw the block frontage map where the storefronts are required. But one thing that we've proposed is to exempt mixed use buildings from some of the multifamily design standards as sort of incentive to limit some of the standards and to encourage mixed use buildings. And, you know, so also exempting them from facade articulation standards and minimum open space. They're already required to do the storefront on the ground level, and we figure that's the most important. And so we figure let's allow them some flexibility for the design of the upper floors, as long as they get the ground floor right and we get the uses in. So that was sort of a compromise trade-off that we felt was worth it. Next slide. And then the rest, we've got site design standards. Again, they apply to non-residential and multifamily development, except, of course, the flex industrial. And then you can see the different topics there. I'll get into residential amenity space, but the other ones are internal ped access and design, which is pretty simple. You know, just make sure we have a connected pedestrian system and you've got a pathway between the building and the street. Vehicular circulation and parking has some basic standards there as well. Most of those apply to bigger sites. And then surface area and mechanical equipment, I'll cover that. And then there's a basic site lighting standard to make sure that you are not creating lighting that impacts your neighbors, for instance, and also promoting lighting that goes downward to promote dark skies. Next slide. So residential amenity space, this is new. And what we're proposing here is that there's some basic open space standards in conjunction with any new multifamily development. And so this requires 100 square foot per unit if you've got a studio or one bedroom dwelling, and 150 for 2 bedroom plus units. If you've got a complex that has a mix of those, you simply add them up. And then our standards say, well, they look at you. There's a number of ways you can meet that standard. You could do a common courtyard, which we call private internal common area. You could do a shared roof deck. You could do private ground level open space, like the townhouse image in your middle there, middle on the right or lower right. You could do private balcony. And you could also do shared indoor rec space, but you could see like balconies and shared indoor rec space, you can use those for up to a quarter of your total requirement. So we still want to encourage them, but we don't want all of your open space just to be some indoor space. We want mostly some outdoor stuff and shared stuff.
Hey, Bob, I have a question. Is that 100 square feet of outdoor space, 4 studios in 1 bedroom? You're talking outdoor space, correct?
Well,
Not
there
the
could be
actual
some
square footage for a 1 bedroom or a studio unit.
So it's square foot of required residential
Outdoor
amenity space.
Okay,
So
perfect.
again,
Never mind. I
yeah,
read that wrong. Never mind. I immediately
good
read
clarification.
that. Wait a minute. How could you live in 100 square feet? This was like,
Good.
Sorry. My brain.
Good
went somewhere else.
clarification.
I apologize. Yep.
And then another key point is a lot of it's about the quality of the space. So we've got here again standards for if you do a courtyard, which we call, and again, common indoor rec space. We've got some prescriptive basic standards here that they should meet, that should improve the usability and the visibility of those in the design of those spaces. Next slide. And then you do have some very limited service area mechanical equipment standards, but we want to scrap those and start fresh with something we've worked on a lot of developments. And so they deal with the location and the screening of any ground level service areas and mechanical equipment. But also these utility meters and gas meters are important for multifamily and commercial developments, both the location, and if you put them in a visible spot, screen them. So, don't do the versions on the right, which are kind of lazy designs, but try to be a little bit more thoughtful and work with your local service provider before you do your architectural designs. So that's probably what happened on the right when they designed the building first and talked to the service providers too late. And then roof and mechanical equipment is another thing. Next slide. Then we get into building design standards. So the 3 sections there: massing and articulation, materials, and blank wall provisions. And so massing and articulation, again, these deal with multifamily and larger commercial buildings. So they simply say, let's articulate your building with features no more than every 50 feet and do at least 3 features in those 50-foot intervals. So you can see here that this building did roof line, varied roof line with different gables. They did use the window patterns. They actually did more treatments. They also did porches in each one, and then they got balconies to separate the provisions. So this allows some choices, that applicants can kind of pick and choose from that menu of options. Next slide. And this next one is when you do a really big building, you need, in addition to the smaller scale articulation, usually you need to do something bigger. When you get a building that's over than that's bigger than 100 feet long, you need to do something a little bit bigger. So you can see with the graphic there, do a bigger courtyard or building modulation, or do a projecting modulation with those dimensions 6 by 15. Or you could do a change in materials and facade elevations, changing window wall design variations to make it look a little different. So we try to provide some prescriptive options, but we also allow departures to do something that doesn't fit in those prescriptive boxes, provided it meets the intent. It's a pretty important provision, I think, because I've seen buildings that could have been a lot better that didn't do things. Next slide. And then for materials, mostly what this is, it says when you do concrete block or metal or synthetic stucco, there's some conditions on them. Like if you do concrete block, just don't do your entire building in play smooth faced in one color concrete block. Mix it up a little bit, like the upper left example. Metal siding mainly looks at when you do the trim, and if you do a commercial building with metal siding, I believe it says, do concrete or concrete block or brick on the first couple feet above the sidewalk level. Same thing for if you do EIFS, which is another term for synthetic stucco, which fortunately is not being used very much anymore because it doesn't weather very well, especially in Aberdeen. Probably doesn't. So people are using.
It never rains here. Come on.
Yeah, hardy panel.
Sunny. Look outside.
Yeah, hardy panel and hardy siding is being used much more often. Is much more versatile than EIFS. And then lastly, blank wall treatments. We had some good discussion with the committee on this. So we define what a blank wall is. So we say, I believe, taller than 10 feet, greater than 15 feet wide, or greater than, I think it's like 400 or maybe it's 200 square feet. I don't have the standard in front of me. But if you have that, you need to treat it. And the text talks about different ways you could do it. Landscaping is the easiest one. Or you could do murals or artwork or building articulation or with a display window. Just don't do the big blank wall with an X through it, like there in the picture.
We
And
nominated, remember, we nominated the mayor to paint a mural on that at the last meeting.
yeah, that's right.
So,
Um,
I
so,
did
and this is,
what was that?
I did design a mural for that building too.
oh, good,
Oh, okay.
good. And it's
starting
particularly
tomorrow.
important for your couplet heading over to Hoquiam there, because you got some of those uses that design for one street but not the other. Next slide. Okay, and then landscaping, this is largely new, but some of the materials are carryover from existing. You can see the different sections here. You do have some landscaping type standards right now, and we largely use the same types, but we just updated some of the details. And the graphics, go compare the old graphics to the new ones. But the chart is a handy thing here, and it compares the differences between what the purpose is, what the screening requirements are, and then just some of the planting details. And then the next slide gets into some of the site planning details on, when do you need a landscaping screen? And you can see there on the left is your developing use. On the right are your existing abutting uses, zones, or if you front on a street. So you can see in some cases it says, like if you're in a high intensity residential use, and that's what you're developing. So that would mean like a apartment complex, and you front on a RL zone. It says do a fence plus landscape type A, B, or C, 15 feet wide. That would be your standard there. If you're doing, if you've got outdoor service or storage, and your adjacent properties in the flex industrial, you don't have to do anything. Or wait, no, we say, actually, that's wrong. You just do a fence and either 5 feet of type A or 10 feet of type B landscaping. So that's kind of how that works. We tried to, if you're in a like zone, and some you don't have to do anything. So those are the blank squares. But where you wanted to have at least a fence or some buffers, that's where you've got some of the standards there. And a lot of these are pretty close to your current standards. So next slide. Parking. Ian's going to talk about the couple parking slides here.
Great. So yes, there's a lot of stuff in this chapter that related to the size of the spaces and how they're laid out. There's a lot of detail actually in the existing code that I think we need to talk a little bit more to make sure there's a place that there's a place for stuff to land. Catching enough of it. I think a lot of it's in Title 12. Anyhow, so we've got how many spaces are required, how it needs to be laid out, and then some sort of provisions for different circumstances that you may find. The big one is for shell buildings, right? And that just means a building where it's the use is not exactly defined, and right, it's parking is applied based on the use, right? Then what do you do in that situation? So currently your standards again is kind of like a long list, and they're quite varied from use to use. A lot of them are defined based on the number of employees, which can be difficult, and changes over time. So the new standards are a lot more consistent. You'll see it's 1 per 300 square feet for a lot of these. That's definitely on the higher end of what we see and what we recommend anyhow in communities. But it provides consistency. It does reduce your standards in a couple cases, especially for restaurants. I'm not sure if you've got a very stringent standard right now currently for restaurants. And this provides a little bit more flexibility there, and then also more consistency. And again, if you don't know exactly what kind of use is going to go in, it's okay in a lot of cases already. Residential generally is keeping with the 2 spaces per dwelling, as Lisa mentioned. We did say that there, if you'd say a studio or a 1-bedroom unit in an apartment building, or I think in a middle housing building, we have to make sure. I think, yeah, that's how it's written. Or if it's an accessory dwelling unit, then there's only 1 parking space required. Your current rules maintained with just a half a space. I believe that's right for senior housing per unit, and then also cottage housing would have a little bit of a lower parking standard. There's no parking required in the downtown mixed use zone, and that would now apply to residential uses as well. But then there is the shell building permit standard, which Bob knows more about than me, but it would be based on the tenant improvements, and that's just something the director would be able to work out with the applicant. Anything else you want to say on that, Bob?
I think a good example is just if it's a commercial, like a strip mall building, you're probably just going to use the 1 to 300 standard that Ian just talked about, because we structured that so most of the commercial uses have a common standard for just much easier functional reasons.
Great. And then just one other change is that to allow tandem parking for residential uses, under a lot of traditional zoning codes, the garage is the parking space and the driveway doesn't count. But I think functionally, I think a lot more people park cars in the driveways than they actually do in their garages. So we want to recognize that. And then I think, as we've noted, that would require, if you have a accessible alley, a usable alley, then the parking would have to be accessed off of that. Back to Bob.
All right, home stretch here. We had some good discussion with the committee on signage, and so we've got some robust new sign code here. This is something we've worked with a number of communities on, and with attorneys, which is important because you had a big national legal Supreme Court case on signage called Reed versus Gilbert out of Arizona, which essentially requires that your sign code be content neutral in most cases. But the updates mostly deal with sign illumination, freestanding signs, building mounted signs, digital signs, and we continue to prohibit billboards, new billboards, that is. So illumination, the handy chart here kind of explains some of the different types, and each of these types has different permissions. Some are allowed everywhere, some are only not allowed in certain zones. So things like if you look at the second to the bottom, internally illuminated cabinet signs, box signs is another term for them. They are allowed in the commercial zone, waterfront, and flex industrial, but they're not allowed in the NC mixed use, and they're not allowed in downtown, because in those zones we thought we should have some of the other sign types, which are more in keeping with the historic pedestrian-oriented character, including signs that are illuminated externally by lights hanging down, or these channel letter signs, the top one, or similarly reverse channel lines, or these push through, or even neon. Next slide. And then we've got freestanding sign standards we classified 4 different types of freestanding signs. Pole signs and monument are the 2 obvious ones that you think of, but we had some good discussions on pole signs and really whether you needed to have them or promote more of them in the future, because Aberdeen's not on a freeway, you just got the arterials running through it, and so unlike those towns with freeways and the giant arterials that go through it. You kind of don't need these big, super tall signs. You could probably get by with some lower monument signs. One exception might be the, so we went through the committee with this, and we proposed to not allow new pole signs except in the waterfront zone west of the railroad tracks. And the reason, because those trains are often there. And I noticed in one of the Google Earth Street Views that those signs were actually designed so the bottom of it is right at the top of where the trains are, so you can still see the sign where the train's passing through. So it's like, okay, that makes sense. But otherwise, you can see here that we've got location and setback standards, the maximum quantity, maximum height, and the sign area we cover in another section that I'll get to in a second. Next slide. And here's where we get into that. So we got these two charts. So what's unique, we've got some unique standards here. So this allows the applicant to base their sign area standards on either the length of the street frontage of their property or the size of the property. And it's something that we used in Wenatchee and has turned out good. People like having that choice, and the committee liked it, so we're going with it. The second part of this is generally it's proportional. It says, well, the bigger your property or your frontage is, the bigger the sign you get, which seems fair. But you know, so you can see there the allowable sign area and then the height, it goes up the bigger your properties are. The second part of this is we allow kind of bonus size and height for signs that have dark backgrounds or shading. And let's go to the next slide. Kind of the reason for that with our work over the years is we found that people like signs that have dark backgrounds and colors. So if you just look at the two examples, and it's just that we found that people kind of like those signs better. They look a little bit better. So our thought is, well, let's allow them to have a little bit bigger sign if they incorporate that. Not prohibit the white background version, but just promote the other type to be a little larger. And again, the committee liked that idea, so we're going with it, at least in the draft. Building mounted signs, you can see here a similar approach where the bigger your building is, your sign should generally be proportional to it. So you can see here that the bigger your building gets, the bigger percentage of the facade that your sign can cover. But we also say that the picture on the left there kind of shows the approach that, you know, if you've got a building that has these articulations, excuse me, your signage shouldn't exceed no more than 2/3 of the widths of the storefront articulation. So in that case, it's the space between the columns. You know, so it should just be proportional, not only to the facade, but some of the architectural features of the building. Another feature here with incentives is internal lighting. So we say that, well, if you don't have internal lighting, if it's just a signboard that either doesn't have any lighting or maybe has some lights hanging that face the signage, those, you know, generally you can, I think it looks pretty good to allow bigger signage in those cases. So you can see there, if you've got a 150, if your tenant facade is about 150 square feet, your sign with internal lighting can be 15%, and you can go up to 25% if you don't have internal lighting. And the next slide explains this a little bit, I think. There you go. On the left, you can see that's about the size of your sign with internal lighting, and you could get much bigger if you don't have internal lighting. Next slide. The other big topic of discussion is digital and changeable copy signage, because you see more and more it's getting a heck of a lot easier to do these digital signs and even these video signs. And so it's important to get out in front of it a little bit and to regulate it, but it's a tough thing to regulate. The approach that we decided to go with is regulate by, well, how much of the sign should be allowed to be digital, and we said 1/3. So let's allow it, but let's just keep it limited, and let's just not allow you to do all of your monument or pole sign to be all video sign. That's a bit distracting. So, but we said about 1/3. So the graphic there explains that. The committee chose not to allow digital signs on buildings, since that seems like, you know, didn't want to mess with the architectural integrity of the buildings and just kind of let them be on these freestanding signs. And that was our suggestion to begin with. And that's similar to other communities, routes they've gone. We do have some flexibility on what technology is used, provided that the brightness or display pattern doesn't cause a safety hazard. And then try to have some, I know this is tough to regulate, but try to at least have some measurable light trespass standards at the property line. You know, it's tough to regulate, but you probably at least want to have something on the books just in case. Next slide. And then temporary signs. This is a big one for the kind of the free speech, content neutral issue. And so we've got provisions here for 5 different types of temporary signs that you can see there. And then the next slide kind of shows, you know, talks about, well, when are these allowed? And what's important with this is to regulate commercial signs can be regulated much more intensively than non-commercial signs, because then you're getting into the free speech stuff. And so, and also if signs on private property, you don't want to mess with it too much. You know, if it's in the public right of way, you could regulate it more because it's been in the public right of way. And then so that you can see for each of the 5 types of temporary signs, we've got, again, the standards for commercial, non-commercial, private property versus public right of way. So each of them have the setup of standards here. And let me see what I don't know if this is the last slide. Okay, go back and I'll just, so for each of those, there's some different standards on again, placement and size and quality and some of the limitations. And I'll just stop there because there's a ton of details on that. But if you're into signage and regulating, check it out. So with that, we have these dates, and maybe Lisa, if you want to clarify any of this, or if you want to take this slide and kind of talk about the next steps.
Yeah, so the first reading of the ordinance, we were scheduled to bring it forward on July 24th, but being that this is a complete overhaul of the code and we're still struggling getting our suggested changes in, it made sense to kick it back to August 14th to provide time for council and staff and the community to suggest changes and get those incorporated in before the first reading. So we're going to do the first reading of the ordinance on the 14th, and then the second reading on August 28th will be also the public hearing. So the public hearing will go to the 28th.
Any other
And then
comments?
provided we get any, if there are no comments, let's just say for whatever reason that there's nobody has any comments after the public hearing, nothing comes in at the public hearing, the council could take it from second to third at the 28th, or they could take it into the first meeting in September for a third reading and approval. So there is some time. So it just, you know, it depends what comes in.
Any other comments or questions or suggestions? Overwhelmed?
Yeah, that was really good.